Ethan Walker only meant to check a few storefronts before the mall opened for the day, walking through the marble corridors with a paper cup of coffee in one hand, and his collar turned up against the early autumn chill, drifting in through the revolving doors. It was the kind of quiet morning ritual he had followed for years, moving through hallways most people never noticed him in, pausing occasionally to glance at a window display or straighten a fallen sign, until he stopped near the main atrium, where the soft gold light poured through the glass ceiling and landed directly on his ex-wife. Vanessa Carter stood there laughing, her arm looped through the arm of a man in an obviously expensive suit, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone who wanted very badly to be seen and admired by everyone around her. She spotted Ethan almost immediately, and instead of looking away or offering a polite nod, she smiled the practiced smile of a woman performing for an audience, pulling her new husband a little closer. As if presenting a trophy she had waited years to finally win, she introduced Richard Sterling with theatrical pride, calling him proof that she had finally upgraded her life after so many years of settling for less, and Richard, sensing an opening to perform as well, reached into his coat and tossed a few folded bills onto the floor near Ethan's feet, assuming without a second thought that the quiet man in the plain jacket was nothing more than mall staff, waiting patiently to be tipped for holding open a door. Neither of them noticed the faint flicker of amusement behind Ethan's calm eyes, and neither of them had the smallest idea that the man they had just humiliated in front of a dozen strangers was the very owner of the building they were standing inside of, a fact that would surface soon enough, and in a manner neither of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. Ethan Walker was 42 years old, and he still drove a sedan that was nearly 10 years old, the kind of car nobody looked at twice in a parking garage, otherwise filled with polished imports and gleaming luxury badges. He liked his coffee simple, his mornings early, and his routines unremarkable. Arriving at Walker Plaza, before most of the shops had even raised their metal gates, greeting the security staff by name as they nodded back with the easy familiarity of men who had known him for years and never once questioned why he showed up so early. He never announced himself, and he never needed to, because the people who worked there had long since stopped wondering why the man in the plain gray jacket walked every hallway as though he owned the place, mostly because none of them realized how literally true that actually was. Ethan preferred inspecting things with his own eyes, rather than trusting a report emailed to him by someone else. Checking the tile work near the fountains, the brightness of the lighting above the escalators, the condition of the benches where tired shoppers rested their bags after long afternoons, learning more about his business through those quiet mornings than any spreadsheet could ever hope to tell him. To the public, he was invisible, a man who blended into crowds and avoided headlines with the same discipline other men reserved for closing million-dollar deals. And that invisibility was never an accident, but a choice made deliberately, born from years of learning exactly what happens to a person once the world discovers how much he is truly worth. At home, Ethan was raising a 9-year-old daughter named Emily on his own, packing her lunch every morning before dropping her at school on his way to the mall, a routine he guarded fiercely because it was one of the few parts of his life that felt entirely untouched by business or money. Emily knew her father owned something important, though she had never fully grasped the scale of it. And she often teased him gently about his old car, asking why they couldn't drive something nicer like some of her friends' parents did. Ethan would only smile and tell her that a car was just a car, and that the things worth having in life rarely came with a price tag attached to them at all. He had married Vanessa when they were both still young and hopeful, and for a while their life together had felt simple in the best possible way, filled with quiet dinners and modest apartments, and none of the noise that later consumed her. But somewhere along the way, Vanessa began to measure their marriage against the lives of other couples, growing convinced that Ethan's plainness was a permanent condition rather than a private choice, certain that a man so uninterested in appearances could never provide the kind of life she believed she deserved. She left believing she understood him completely, packing her bags on a gray afternoon while insisting she needed more than what he was willing to give her, taking little Emily with her only on the weekends they had agreed to, never once suspecting that beneath his modest exterior sat one of the most carefully guarded fortunes in the entire city, a truth Ethan had never once tried to use to change her mind or win her back. He had built his life around a quiet principle that almost no one around him fully understood. The belief that a person's value could never be measured by the size of a house or the label stitched into a jacket sleeve. That belief had cost him a marriage once, and it had cost him more privately than he ever let anyone see. Yet it never once shook his resolve, because Ethan Walker had learned early in life that money reveals character but never creates it. He remembered his father telling him something similar decades earlier. Sitting across a worn kitchen table, long before the family business became what it eventually grew into, warning him that wealth would always attract people who wanted something from him, and that the only reliable way to know who genuinely cared was to occasionally hide what he had from the world. His father had started with a single small shopping center on the edge of town, purchased with borrowed money and years of stubborn work, slowly acquiring one property after another over 3 decades, until the family name quietly sat behind more than a dozen commercial developments across the state. Ethan remembered helping sweep the floors of that very first property as a boy, long before he understood what any of it meant, and he remembered his father refusing to buy a bigger house even after the business began to succeed, insisting that comfort should never be confused with excess. Those early lessons had shaped Ethan far more deeply than any business school ever could have, teaching him that a legacy worth protecting was built through patience and consistency rather than the kind of flashy gestures Richard seemed to specialize in. When his father grew ill in his final years, Ethan had taken over the daily operations quietly, learning every corner of the business from the ground up, determined never to let the empire become the kind of hollow status symbol his father had always warned him against. Ethan had taken that lesson further than his father ever intended, choosing to live so quietly that even his own wife had spent years believing him ordinary and unremarkable. He walked through the mall that morning with the same unremarkable calm he always carried, unaware that within the hour his past and his present would collide directly in the atrium he had built with his own resources, and unaware that the woman who once dismissed him for being plain was about to do it again, this time in front of an audience that included several of the very people who worked for him, without knowing it. Vanessa blinked twice when she recognized the man standing near the directory sign. Caught briefly off guard that fate would place Ethan directly in her path on the very morning meant to celebrate her new life, she recovered quickly. Exchanging a few brittle pleasantries meant more for Richard's benefit than for Ethan's own, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby shoppers to catch the performance unfolding between them. When Richard stepped forward, broad-shouldered and confident in the particular way of men convinced their own importance is obvious to everyone around them, Vanessa slipped her hand around his arm and delivered her introduction with theatrical satisfaction, declaring simply that this was her husband now, as though the sentence alone could erase everything that had come before it. Richard looked Ethan over, slowly, from his scuffed shoes to his plain jacket, letting a thin and faintly condescending smile spread across his face before asking, almost lazily, whether Ethan worked here, the question landing less like curiosity and more like an insult, wrapped carefully in politeness. Vanessa answered before Ethan had the chance to, saying that he had always preferred ordinary jobs and ordinary lives, her tone dripping with a satisfaction that suggested she believed she had finally won some invisible contest between them that had lasted years since their divorce. Richard, delighted by the opening she had given him, began listing his possessions the way other men might list their achievements, describing a limited edition watch collection worth more than most homes, a garage filled with imported sports cars he rarely drove, a sprawling estate that required its own full-time staff to maintain, and a private jet he used for business trips across 3 different continents whenever the mood struck him. Ethan only smiled through all of it, offering no rebuttal and no defense, standing there with the same unbothered calm that had once frustrated Vanessa so deeply during their marriage. And Richard, mistaking that silence for envy rather than restraint, felt his confidence swell even further with every word he spoke aloud. Richard went further still, pulling out his phone to show off photographs from a recent trip to the coast, a chartered yacht gleaming white against blue water, a dinner table set with dishes that cost more than most people earned in a month, narrating each image as though Ethan might never have imagined such things existed outside of magazines. He asked, almost cruelly, whether Ethan had ever tasted wine that cost more than $1,000 a bottle, and when Ethan simply shrugged and said he preferred coffee most mornings, Richard laughed loud enough that a young mother pushing a stroller nearby turned her head in surprise. Vanessa joined the laughter a beat later, though something in her expression seemed to falter slightly, some small flicker of doubt crossing her face before she smoothed it away and reached again for Richard's arm, as though anchoring herself to a decision she needed desperately to believe was still the right one. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and unhurried, telling them both that he hoped they enjoyed their morning and that he had some business of his own to attend to elsewhere in the building. Richard smirked and told him to run along then, tossing one final comment about how some people were simply built for small jobs, while others were built for bigger things, a remark that drew no reaction from Ethan beyond a polite nod, before he turned and walked calmly toward the executive elevators at the far end of the atrium. Vanessa watched him go for a moment, longer than she meant to, an old and unfamiliar unease settling briefly in her chest before Richard pulled her attention back toward a nearby jewelry display, already talking about which piece she deserved to celebrate their morning together. Encouraged by his own momentum, Richard leaned in and asked Ethan, with a chuckle meant to be shared with Vanessa rather than with Ethan himself, whether he had ever even seen a jet up close in his entire life, or whether the closest he came to luxury was polishing the floors beneath one. A few shoppers passing nearby slowed their steps, sensing something uncomfortable in the exchange, though none of them dared to intervene in a conversation that seemed to belong to strangers they had never met. Vanessa laughed along softly, adding that Ethan had always been content with very little, a comment she meant as a quiet victory rather than the accidental compliment it actually was. Richard's ambitions that morning were not limited to impressing his wife in front of a stranger, because he had arrived at the mall with a much larger plan already forming in his mind, one that involved acquiring a significant stretch of retail space for a new investment venture he was certain would make headlines across the entire city. He spoke loudly about wanting to invest tens of millions of dollars into premium storefronts, gesturing toward the surrounding shops as though the entire mall were simply another asset waiting patiently to be absorbed into his growing empire of properties. Vanessa, eager to reinforce her own sense of arrival, added that this was the very mall where the two of them liked to shop on weekends, speaking with the casual entitlement of someone who believed ownership was only a signature away from being hers as well someday soon. Richard's arrogance sharpened with every passing minute, and he began referring to Ethan using a rotating series of dismissive labels, calling him an employee, then a guard, then simply the help, each phrase delivered with a little more amusement than the last, as though testing how far the joke could stretch before Ethan finally reacted. At one point, he even snapped his fingers and asked Ethan to fetch him a coffee, the gesture careless and automatic, as though summoning a waiter in a restaurant he visited often and tipped poorly. A few nearby shoppers slowed their pace even further, sensing the tension building quietly in the atrium, some exchanging uneasy glances while others pretended not to notice at all, burying their faces in their phones instead. Ethan remained composed through every remark, his expression unreadable, his silence never once cracking under the weight of Richard's condescension or Vanessa's quiet cruelty toward a man she once claimed to love. From a distance, Sophia Bennett watched the scene unfold with growing concern, recognizing immediately the disrespect being aimed at the one man in the entire building whose real identity none of the onlookers understood, and she began walking toward the group with quick, purposeful steps, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Ethan caught her eye across the atrium and gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent signal that the moment was not yet ready to be interrupted. And Sophia, trusting him completely, after years of working closely together, slowed her approach and waited quietly near a nearby column instead, watching everything unfold. Sophia Bennett had known Ethan for nearly 11 years, first hired as a young operations manager fresh out of graduate school, back when Walker Plaza was still a single struggling property, rather than the flagship of a much larger portfolio. She had watched him turn down opportunities to expand his public profile again and again, choosing instead to reinvest quietly in the neighborhoods around each property, funding scholarships for employees' children and covering medical bills for staff members who never even learned where the money truly came from. Over the years, she had become the only person outside his immediate family who understood the full scope of what Ethan actually owned, and she guarded that secret with the same seriousness she brought to every contract that crossed her desk. She had watched Vanessa once, years earlier, at a small holiday gathering for staff, laughing loudly about wanting a husband who could take her somewhere exotic for their anniversary, never noticing that the quiet man refilling drinks near the back of the room could have bought the entire resort she was describing without blinking twice. Sophia had never judged Ethan for staying silent about it then, and she did not judge him now for staying silent a little longer in the atrium, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that Ethan Walker measured his choices not in profit, but in the kind of person he wanted to remain for the rest of his life. Later that same morning, Richard arrived for a scheduled meeting with the mall's executive board, walking into the glass-walled conference room with the swagger of a man who believed the deal was already finished before it had even begun. He had told Vanessa during the drive-over that this contract would become the crown jewel of his growing portfolio, and she had spent the ride imagining herself as the polished wife of a major property investor, already picturing the parties and headlines that would surely follow such a lucrative partnership. Sophia greeted them both at the door with practiced professional warmth, though her eyes carried a quiet awareness that Richard completely failed to notice as he strode past her toward the head of the long conference table without waiting to be shown where to sit. Richard settled into his chair without waiting to be invited, immediately demanding to speak with the owner directly, insisting loudly that he never signed anything without meeting the person actually in charge of an operation this large and this profitable. Sophia answered simply that the owner would be joining them shortly, her tone even and unreadable despite the tension building beneath the surface of the room, and Richard let out a short laugh, saying he hoped the owner understood how real business was conducted in a city like this one. Vanessa nodded along beside him, adding her own comment about hoping the mall's leadership matched the sophistication of its interior design, entirely unaware that she was only minutes away from the most humbling moment of her entire adult life. Richard tapped his fingers impatiently against the polished table, glancing at his watch and remarking that he had other meetings scheduled that afternoon. Important people waiting on him across the city, and that he expected whoever ran this place to respect his time the way every other partner in his life did. One of the younger board members exchanged a brief glance with Sophia, who kept her expression perfectly neutral, folding her hands together and simply reminding Richard that patience tended to be rewarded in negotiations of this size, a comment that seemed to say, describing the changes he intended to make to the mall's tenant structure. Mentioning that he planned to push out several smaller local businesses in favor of larger, more prestigious international brands that would better reflect his own reputation. Vanessa added that she had always thought some of the smaller shops looked a little tired anyway, a comment that drew no visible reaction from anyone at the table besides a faint tightening around Sophia's eyes. Since several of those very shops belonged to families Ethan had personally helped keep afloat during difficult years. The door to the conference room opened only a few minutes later, and Ethan walked in wearing the same plain jacket he had worn all morning, carrying the same quiet posture that had defined him for years among people who had no idea who he was. Richard's brow furrowed immediately, assuming the man had simply wandered into the wrong meeting by mistake, while Vanessa felt a strange, cold knot tighten somewhere in her stomach that she could not yet fully explain to herself. Richard asked, with a trace of open irritation, whether Ethan had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the building, and before Ethan could offer any kind of response, every executive seated at the long table rose to their feet in unison, chairs scraping softly against the polished floor, in a wave that moved from one end of the room to the other. Sophia stood as well, her voice clear and steady as she made the introduction that would change the entire shape of the morning, presenting Ethan Walker to the stunned room as the sole owner of Walker Plaza and every property carrying its name across the region. The room fell into a silence so complete that the quiet hum of the air conditioning suddenly became audible, and Richard's face drained of color as the weight of his own earlier words came crashing back down on him all at once, one careless comment after another replaying itself in his mind. Vanessa's breath caught somewhere in her throat, her mind racing backward through every moment of the morning, replaying the coffee request, the folded bills tossed carelessly onto the floor, the casual cruelty she had encouraged without a single second of hesitation only hours earlier. Ethan walked calmly to the head of the table and took his seat, thanking the board members for standing while gesturing for them to sit back down, his manner entirely unchanged from the quiet man who had been mocked in the atrium less than an hour before. He glanced briefly at Richard, then at Vanessa, offering neither of them anger nor satisfaction, only the same steady patience he had carried through every insult thrown his way that morning. Sophia distributed a folder to each board member, opening the meeting exactly as she would have with any other prospective partner, though the air in the room remained thick with the shock still settling over Richard and Vanessa. One of the younger executives, unable to help herself, glanced toward Vanessa with an expression somewhere between pity and disbelief, quickly looking away when Vanessa caught her eye, her cheeks burning with a humiliation far sharper than anything she had inflicted on Ethan that morning. Years earlier, long before the divorce, and long before Richard Sterling ever entered the picture, Ethan's family had quietly built one of the most successful commercial property empires in the entire region, a legacy that began humbly with his father's small chain of storefronts, and grew steadily into something far larger than most people ever realized existed behind the modest name on the paperwork. When his father passed away after a long illness, Ethan inherited not only the business itself, but the full weight of the responsibility that came with protecting everything his family had spent decades building from nothing, a burden he carried with a seriousness that never once matched his understated, almost forgettable appearance in public settings. He made the deliberate choice to conceal his identity from nearly everyone in his personal life, driven by a simple but persistent desire to be loved for who he truly was, rather than for everything he happened to own on paper. Vanessa had never known the truth during their marriage, and she had spent those years pushing him constantly toward a lifestyle of luxury he had little genuine interest in pursuing, mistaking his restraint for a lack of ambition rather than recognizing it as a conscious and deliberate choice, rooted in values she never once bothered to understand or ask him about directly. When Ethan refused to change who he fundamentally was simply to satisfy her growing craving for status and recognition among her friends, convinced in her heart that she was walking away from a man who would remain ordinary and unremarkable for the rest of his life. Ethan never tried to stop her that day, and he never once revealed the truth that might have changed her mind entirely, because he understood, even then, that a love built on that kind of hidden bargain would never have been real in the first place, no matter how convincing it might have felt to either of them at the time. Back in the present, Richard attempted desperately to salvage what remained of the meeting, stumbling through an apology that arrived far too late to feel sincere to anyone seated in the room, insisting repeatedly that he still wanted to move forward with the partnership. Despite the awkward and humiliating start to their acquaintance that morning, Ethan remained composed throughout, never once raising his voice or referencing the humiliation from earlier that morning, choosing instead to let the situation speak entirely for itself through the facts already sitting quietly on the table in front of him. The executive board, prepared for exactly this kind of scenario long before the meeting ever began, presented a detailed history of Richard's prior business dealings, outlining a clear pattern of ethical violations and broken contracts that had followed him across several failed ventures in other cities over the years. One board member read aloud from a folder describing lawsuits from former partners, unpaid contractors, and at least one investment fund that had quietly severed ties with Richard after discovering irregularities in his financial disclosures. Richard's proposal was rejected on the spot without further discussion. The decision delivered with the same calm professionalism Ethan had maintained all morning, leaving Richard stunned into a silence far heavier and more uncomfortable than the one he had inflicted just hours earlier in the atrium downstairs. He tried once more to argue his case, raising his voice slightly, but Sophia simply gathered the folder from the table and reminded him, politely but firmly, that the decision had already been finalized before he ever walked into the room that day. Refusing to accept defeat quietly, Richard requested a private word with Ethan in the hallway outside the conference room, attempting a different approach entirely, one built on flattery rather than bravado, telling Ethan that two powerful men like themselves should be able to find common ground regardless of how the morning had started. Ethan listened politely, then explained, without a trace of malice, that his concern had never been about the earlier insults themselves, but about the pattern of behavior the board had uncovered. the unpaid contractors and abandoned partners who had trusted Richard with their livelihoods only to be left behind once the arrangement stopped benefiting him. Richard's expression hardened at that, his charm evaporating quickly into something closer to threat, warning Ethan that he had connections throughout the city, and that word would spread about how difficult Walker Plaza was to work with. Ethan only nodded once, telling him calmly that he was welcome to spread whatever word he liked, before turning and walking back toward his office without offering Richard the reaction he had clearly been hoping for. Later that day, Vanessa asked to speak with Ethan privately, finding him standing near one of the quiet courtyards outside the main building where the autumn air had turned crisp and cool against the fading afternoon light filtering through the trees. Her composure finally broke there, tears slipping quietly down her face as she admitted that years ago she had only ever seen the value of his wallet and never once truly seen the value of his character, a confession that seemed to cost her more than anything she had said aloud in years of marriage or since. She told him she had spent so long chasing the idea of a bigger life that she had never stopped to ask herself what kind of life would actually make her happy, and that watching him stand so calmly through everything Richard had said only reminded her of the man she had once known and failed to appreciate. Ethan listened without anger, offering no blame and no bitterness in return, simply telling her, gently but firmly, that she had not left a poor man all those years ago, but rather a man who had loved her completely and without condition, something far more valuable than anything Richard could ever offer her in a lifetime. Vanessa had no response to give him, the full weight of his words settling over her far heavier than anything money could ever replace or explain away, and she stood there quietly until the courtyard lights began to flicker on against the darkening sky. In the days that followed, she found herself replaying that afternoon over and over, unable to shake the memory of how calmly Ethan had spoken to her, without cruelty or triumph, as though her own unhappiness troubled him more than any satisfaction he might have taken from finally being seen for who he truly was. She thought back to small moments from their marriage she had barely noticed at the time, the way he used to leave notes in her coat pockets before long workdays, the quiet patience he showed when her own family doubted his prospects at holiday dinners, all of it recolored now by the knowledge of who he had been underneath the plain jackets and modest cars all along. Richard, sensing the distance growing between them, grew irritable at home, snapping over small things and disappearing for long stretches to meetings that seemed to produce fewer and fewer results as the weeks passed. Vanessa began spending more evenings alone in the enormous house he had once used to impress her, finding it colder and emptier than any of the small apartments she had shared with Ethan years before, and slowly beginning to understand exactly what she had traded away. In the days that followed, Ethan resumed his usual routine without hesitation, walking the halls of the mall and stopping, often to speak with the people who kept it running smoothly, the cleaning staff who worked before sunrise, the security guards who knew every entrance by heart, the young employees behind the counters of small shops who had no idea who he truly was beneath the plain jacket he always wore. Every conversation carried the same quiet respect, never once tied to wealth or title, but earned instead through years of simple decency that no fortune could ever purchase outright, no matter how much money someone tried to spend. Richard, still lingering nearby in the uncomfortable aftermath of his failed deal, watched these small exchanges with a growing and increasingly uncomfortable realization, understanding for the first time in his adult life that money could purchase attention, but never genuine respect from another human being who actually knew him. It was a lesson far more expensive than the deal he had just lost that morning, and one he would carry with him long after he finally left the building behind for good, his reputation quietly damaged among the very circles he had hoped to impress. Word of the failed deal spread quickly among other investors in the city, and within weeks, 2 additional partnerships Richard had been counting on fell apart as well, each one citing concerns about his conduct that traced directly back to the story of that single humiliating morning at Walker Plaza. One investor, a longtime friend of Sophia's from an earlier career, later admitted that hearing how Richard treated a man he assumed was beneath him told her everything she needed to know about how he would eventually treat her once the ink dried on any contract between them. Richard tried to explain the misunderstanding to anyone who would listen, insisting that the whole situation had simply been a joke taken out of context. But the story had already spread too far, retold at dinner parties and business lunches across the city, until it became less a piece of gossip and more a quiet warning about the dangers of judging people by their clothing rather than their character. Meanwhile, the small business owners inside Walker Plaza, who Richard had once dismissed as tired and unworthy of the space, continued to thrive under Ethan's quiet stewardship, many of them completely unaware of how close they had come to losing their storefronts to a man who valued only appearances. A woman who ran a small bakery near the east entrance told a co-worker that Ethan had once helped her cover a difficult month of rent without ever mentioning it again afterward, an act she had assumed came from some sympathetic manager rather than the true owner of the entire property. A shoe repair shop that had operated in the same corner for nearly 20 years remained exactly where it always had been, its elderly owner still greeting customers by name every morning, never suspecting that the plain-jacketed man who occasionally stopped to chat about the weather held the deed to the very floor beneath his workbench. These small, unnoticed kindnesses, repeated quietly across dozens of shops and hundreds of employees over the years, had built something Richard's money could never purchase in a single transaction, a foundation of trust that no boastful introduction or flashy watch could ever replicate. Weeks later, Walker Plaza held a public event to announce a new community investment strategy, gathering employees from every level of the organization into the same grand atrium where the entire confrontation had first begun that autumn morning. Strings of warm lights had been hung along the balconies, and a small stage had been built near the fountain, where the folded bills had once landed on the floor at Ethan's feet. Sophia stood at the podium and introduced Ethan to the assembled staff, many of whom were hearing his real name and his full story for the very first time in their lives, murmurs of surprise rippling quietly through the crowd. Ethan stepped forward and spoke plainly, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room as he told them that no mall could ever be built from glass or steel alone, but rather from the everyday kindness of the people who worked within its walls every single day, without recognition or reward. He spoke briefly about his own daughter, Emily, who was seated near the front with her grandmother, telling the crowd that he hoped she would grow up believing that character mattered more than any number printed on a bank statement. The room rose together in genuine applause, a unified response that no amount of money could have ever manufactured on its own, the sound echoing warmly off the glass ceiling above them. Richard, watching from the back of the crowd, quietly slipped out before the applause even finished, unable to remain for a moment that reminded him so clearly of everything he had personally lost that season. Vanessa remained a little longer than he did, watching Ethan from across the crowded room, understanding at last that the greatest fortune she had ever walked away from was never measured in dollars or property, but in the quiet integrity of a man who had never once needed the world's approval to know his own worth. Sophia stood quietly near the edge of the stage as the applause continued, watching Ethan with the same quiet satisfaction she always felt when his work was finally recognized, even if only by the people closest to him rather than the wider world beyond the mall's glass doors. She thought back to the early years of their partnership, the long nights spent reviewing budgets together in a small back office, long before Walker Plaza became the flagship it was now, and she felt a private pride in having helped build something that could hold this much genuine warmth within its walls. She had turned down offers from larger firms over the years, drawn to stay by Ethan's insistence that success should never come at the expense of the people who made it possible, and moments like this one reminded her exactly why she had made that choice again and again. As the crowd began to thin, she caught Ethan's eye across the room and offered a small, knowing smile, the kind shared only between two people who understood exactly how much quiet effort had gone into a moment that looked, to everyone else, effortless. After the applause faded and the crowd began to disperse toward the refreshment tables set up near the fountain, several longtime employees approached Ethan individually, thanking him quietly for things Vanessa had never known about. A security guard whose son's tuition had been covered without ever knowing the source, a cleaning supervisor whose husband's surgery had somehow been paid for during a year the family could not have otherwise afforded it. Each story added another small weight to the growing understanding settling over Vanessa, the realization that Ethan's fortune had never been hidden out of secrecy for its own sake, but so that it could quietly do good without ever becoming a performance for anyone to admire. She approached him one final time near the edge of the atrium, offering a small, genuine smile instead of the brittle one she had worn weeks earlier, telling him simply that she hoped Emily would always know how fortunate she was to have him as her father. Ethan thanked her, and for a moment the years of bitterness between them seemed to soften into something closer to peace. Two people who had once shared a life finding, in the end, a quiet and unexpected respect for who the other had become. As the sun began to set that evening, painting the glass ceiling above the atrium in shades of orange and gold, Ethan left the building the same way he always did, climbing into his old sedan while employees on every floor offered him warm, sincere smiles that had absolutely nothing to do with his hidden fortune or the story now spreading through every department. Emily sat beside him in the passenger seat, chattering happily about her day at school, entirely unbothered by the fact that her father owned the building they had just walked out of together. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone around him, because the respect he had earned over the years was never built on the size of his empire, but on the simple, consistent way he treated every single person he met, regardless of their place in the world or the size of their paycheck. Somewhere behind him, the lights of Walker Plaza glowed steadily against the darkening sky, illuminating the same hallways where a stranger had once tossed a few folded bills at his feet, without ever imagining the truth standing right in front of him. Ethan glanced once in the rearview mirror as he pulled out of the parking garage, not with pride, but with a quiet gratitude for everything the building represented, the years of patient work, the countless small kindnesses that no headline would ever capture, and the daughter beside him, who would grow up understanding that a person's worth was never something that could be purchased or displayed. True class, as it turned out, was never about what a person owned or displayed for others to see, but about how they carried themselves quietly, especially in the moments when no one around them knew who they truly were.